You landed on The Substance, a podcast aimed at being biblical, thoughtful, and human. Join us every other week as we engage the culture without the culture war. I'm your host, Philip Marinello, and I'm kind of getting used to the solo thing here. This week I'm joined by Dr. Emilio Alvarez. Dr. Alvarez here, he's an associate provost for lifelong learning over at Asbury Theological Seminary and an author of a wonderful book we're going to get into today. If you're new to The Substance, we are a Christian variety show where every other week we talk for about an hour or so with a wonderful guest related to something substantive in the fields of faith, culture, the arts, things like that. Previous guests include folks like Alan Noble, Kyle Strobel, Karen Swallow Pryor. Past and future guest, very soon, Caitlin Shess. Look out for Caitlin's episode next week. And Courtney Ellis. This week, I'm talking with Dr. Emilio Alvarez about his book on Pentecost. Listeners may recognize the Fullness of Time series back from when we had Dr. Esau McCaulley on for his book on Lent. These books are wonderful. They are short. They're very accessible. And they're doing a wonderful job of giving this current generation of folks, giving us a nice little insight into traditions of the church calendar and liturgy and things that many of us didn't grow up with, are curious about. This Fullness of Time series is a really excellent gateway into these things.
All right, Bishop Alvarez, welcome to The Substance here. Glad we were able to get our schedules together again here.
Yes, I'm excited to be with you. I do apologize. We should have been doing this some time back, and I know that scheduling has been rough. So thank you for your patience.
No, man. I mean, I feel bad. On my end, it was I prepared a bunch for this a few months ago, but you've been through quite a lot personally and with your family as well, right?
Yes, we have. We've been through some family challenges with my father. There are some other extended family members who have gone through some things. But thank God everyone is healthy, strengthened, and recovering. So I thank God for that. Yeah.
So this isn't just going to be me grilling you about your book, but I was excited we have a pretty strong relationship with IVP. And I told you we had Dr. McCaulley on to talk about Lent. I'm very excited to talk about both Pentecost and a number of things with your background, because I did not grow up, and I know a number of the members of our audience did not grow up with strong liturgical or denomination. I mean, we all, even the non-denominational people, that's kind of a denomination. We all have traditions, but the strong liturgical, traditional, the way, every group of people has a way that they do things, but just being more exposed to the global historical church has just been such a blessing for me, and I know so many people as well. So I was excited about this. Briefly, how did you get connected with IVP and Dr. McCaulley to be a part of this Fullness of Time series here?
So Dr. Esau McCaulley is a friend, and we actually resided in the same city. We lived in the same city when he was teaching over at Northeastern Seminary in Rochester, New York, and we had some connections and some contact through that. He's just been a very good friend and a very good guide. I had pitched the first book, Pentecostal Orthodoxy, to IVP some time back, and some other publishers as well. But I really did think that IVP was the one to go for me, particularly because of my affinity for Thomas Oden and his writings. And Thomas Oden did a lot of work with IVP. So I connected with IVP when they accepted the manuscript. Esau and I have become...
That was a couple years ago, right? I listened to some of that, and in preparation a few months ago when I thought we were going to have you on, I listened to a bunch of your podcast interviews with other folks and listened to parts of Pentecostal Orthodoxy. I'm curious about that as well. But that was a couple years ago, right?
So Pentecostal Orthodoxy came out, if all my mind does not escape me, last September, last year.
Okay, so not too long ago.
Not too long ago, right.
Also, bless you, a sub 200-page work for the everyman.
Oh, well, bless you. I hope that that's the truth. It was fun writing it. And it was written out of experience, an experiential spirituality, but also a really deep rooted spirituality in the liturgical and sacramental. I didn't grow up liturgical. I didn't grow up sacramental. I grew up in a Pentecostal denomination where none of that was a reality for us. And yet here we are several years later, writing on the topic. So I pray that it has been a blessing.
Talk briefly, not necessarily related to the book, but you mentioned this in the book. You grew up Pentecostal. You've done a number of things about both being Pentecostal, and now you have a book on Pentecost, similarities and differences in your spiritual upbringing versus the actual liturgical traditions of Pentecost.
Yeah, well, my upbringing was very experiential, very emotive, very phenomenological, very pneumatological, all those things mixed together. It was really signs and wonders, miracles. It was really driven by kind of this primitivistic eschatological tension, as Pentecostalism has that tension. It's very classical. I was raised legalistic.
Amen. I can. A lot of us can relate to that.
You can relate, right, and but really kind of isolated. So we were in a vacuum, I would say. I remember being young in Pentecostalism, very, very young, and yet having the distinct notion, wow, we don't hang with anybody else other than ourselves. So very isolated perspective, not really open to any kind of social, religious notions, versus, my fifth, sixth year of pastoring. I began pastoring when I was 20 years old. And so my fifth or sixth year of pastoring, I'm sitting here and saying to myself, this just can't be it. There has to be way more. So I wanted to really know, why are all Catholics going to hell, according to my Pentecostal preachers? Why are Orthodox going to hell? What is an Orthodox? What's the difference between Anglicans, and why are there so many other traditions and nobody's
Sure.
right except for us?
Yep.
Fast forward, much training, much formation, both academic but also formation from my various mentors, Archbishop Wayne Busada, Eldon Villafane, Troy Anthony Bronner, David Michael Copeland, and both in the liturgical and preaching side, ministerial side. And here I am as a Pentecostal, immersed in the great tradition. And by great tradition, really am talking about the first 7 to 1,000 years of the church, the councils, the creeds, the writings of the fathers. So there's such a distinction now in how I view myself as Pentecostal, neo-Pentecostal, and I can see Pentecostalism not only biblically, Acts chapter 2, but I have a historical framework. So now I can talk to you about Simeon, I can talk to you about Climacus, I can talk to you about Basil, I can talk to you about other areas of the church life which resemble Pentecostalism and are indeed Pentecostal in terms of empowered by the Spirit.
So right at the beginning of this, I want to ask you, so I was excited. We have been, like I said, we had Dr. McCaulley on.
Yeah.
We loved Lent. We got the whole IVP catalog of all the stuff coming out. I'm excited for this whole Fullness of Time series and a lot of their other works there and other publishers' works really highlighting, like you said, the global historical traditions of like the faith passed down, like the church calendar. So when I saw you head on, I started to do a little digging into your background, and I shared it with some of my friends, and they're like, so what is this guy? Is he Pentecostal? Is he Catholic? Is he Anglican? And I was like, well, his bio says charismatic Orthodox, and I don't know what that means. So I'm sure you get a lot of questions, especially when you do platforms like this. So like, how would you describe it? And like, do people understand? Like, do people have a category for charismatic Orthodox in your experience outside of your tradition?
Well, the proper term that we use is Pentecostal Orthodoxy.
Okay.
And Paleo-Orthodoxy is this really big umbrella, right? That's the term defined or developed by Thomas Oden. And Paleo-Orthodoxy is this huge umbrella. And under that umbrella, you can see Robert Weber's Ancient Future Faith. You see Richard Lovelace's Three Stream. You see the Convergence Worship movement, which comes out of the John Wimber movement and the Charismatic Renewal with evangelicals. And there have always been various streams or various expressions historically, even going back to Leslie Newbegin in the Household of God, right? Where he's trying to answer the question, what constitutes the church? And he says the church is Pentecostal, Catholic, and Protestant. And so it was actually the bulk of my work in the PhD. And then after the PhD, I really honed in on the fact that I could be Pentecostal and yet be Orthodox, not big O, right? Because sometimes I say Pentecostal Orthodox.
Sure.
And people start, oh, you're Eastern Orthodox. No, not big O, little O.
And that's some of the stuff you talked about in your first book, right?
Right.
I listened to portions of that, and I heard you talk about interviews with that. I thought that was very interesting, and like we're all doing various, like, our own versions of that, right? Like,
Right.
I don't want to just get into the deconstruction stuff, but like we are all. I feel like, especially COVID gave us all time to slow down. It disrupted a lot of things. It kind of exposed a lot of things, and then the faithful people who are interested in being all in or just figuring out what they believed had to take a look at themselves and really go, like, what do I believe? What do I believe, and where do I want to belong?
Right.
And so now people are trying to figure that out, and I love resources like this, just kind of opening it up to saying, hey, like, we don't need to be afraid.
Right.
Like, it's not like there's going to be a theology quiz at the end when it's our time to go, but it's nice to be able to. It feels like more freely kind of have these conversations and have resources that really encourage us to kind of examine these things in a more purposeful way than I've kind of seen it done kind of widely before.
Yeah, and to that point, I'm always criticized. So I like to tell people that I'm not Orthodox enough to be Orthodox, and I'm not Pentecostal enough for the Pentecostals to be Pentecostal.
Okay.
So we're right in this kind of middle. And I remember that when we started really working on what it meant to be Pentecostal Orthodox and Pentecostals, Neo-Pentecostals recovering the great tradition, I kept, as I write in my book, confronting the Nathaniels of the world, who just kept telling me, there's no way that you can be Pentecostal and recover the great tradition. You have to go to one of the canonical churches. Because, they are the true church. Everyone is arguing they're the true church. And so... Sure,
right?
Right. Everyone is, the Orthodox, the Catholics, the Anglicans, everyone's arguing they're the true church. And so my argument was always going back, biblically, but also historically, and saying, when the charismatic renewal happened on the campuses, on Catholic campuses and, campuses around the country, and Roman Catholics and Anglicans and Episcopalians and even Orthodox were being baptized in the Holy Spirit, there wasn't this big push by Pentecostals saying, hey, guys, now you guys all have to go to Pentecostal churches, right?
Sure, right.
They were speaking in tongues on campus, and nobody came up and said, hey, you guys got to go now to the Pentecostal church down the street and become Pentecostal. And so it's quite confusing to me that as a Pentecostal, that when I recover the Eucharist on a weekly basis, believe in real presence, when I start, developing liturgies and I follow the liturgical calendar and all of these other things, that I'm always told, well, you got to now go to a canonical church. So that has been some of the struggle. And yet, we're growing. The union is growing. The distinction is being made. And I'm getting phone calls, emails, texts, and messages every week. Trust me, every week, about people who have been in Pentecostalism, in charismatic circles that are recovering the great tradition. And they're reading my resource, they're reading other resources, and they're saying, wow, we didn't know this existed. And we're having wonderful and creative conversations.
So that's something else I wanted to talk to you about. One of the things that really intrigued me about your bio when they sent it to me is just your focus on unity. That's something that on this platform, on this podcast, we've talked about, I mean, we're in like the 130 something episodes. This is something we talk about a lot. Like, yes, like it's important that we all study, we try to live it out, we try to do the best with our own, like our tools and our consciences and what have you. But like the family of God is large and diverse.
Yeah.
And drawing lines where they need not be drawn, especially when things are so divisive in the wider culture anyway, like that doesn't work. Just pragmatically, like taking out that we're all brothers and sisters, like we all share the same Father and we'll share the same eternal inheritance. So I would love to hear some of what has been encouraging to you in your unity work in the last several years. What kind of trends have you seen, or what individual instances or movements, like what gives you encouragement and hope about the church universal going forward?
Well, definitely these different expressions that are beginning to be developed even the more. It's interesting because someone asked me the other day, where does all of that come from? And they were shocked by my answer in regards to the 1960s, 1950s. It's already there. And so I'm encouraged by the historical movement and the historical expressions of the Spirit in the life of the church or segments of the church, these fresh expressions which are beginning to happen or not beginning to happen, that have been happening and are now developing, because they bring greater unity. And I'm referring to these expressions where you have this amalgamation of being Bible believers, Spirit-filled, Spirit, believers being led by the Spirit, but also liturgy and sacraments, all of that together. And so I remember I was in my master's work at seminary, and the president of the theological seminary, who's a mentor and a friend, Dr. Dale Irvin, said to me, "You've got to write something on ecumenism, on Christian unity and ecumenism for this panel at Georgetown University." And I'm in a master's degree program. And he's telling me, "You've got to write this proposal for Georgetown." And I'm saying, "What?" And, Cardinal Walter Casper was there and a few others. And so here I am, this baby-faced, preacher, and I'm writing on Christian unity. And it became really became clear to me that there was some, not ambiguity, there was some resistance for the reason of just being known as the true church. And I think that's where I began to understand that, there are just some rules and some invisible walls that people, for whatever reason, will not want to cross, even when faced with the truth. So even if I tell, my Roman Catholic friends, even if we believe on 98, 99%, of everything, there's always going to be that 1% that people are just going to be like, "No, that's a deal breaker." And so I'm really encouraged by, over the years, I heard Cardinal Walter Casper and read his book on spiritual ecumenism. And spiritual ecumenism is, the church works and invites the Spirit into what it's doing. It's an answer to the prayer of Jesus. But over the years, as you know, I wrote it in my book, I've begun to develop the term an ecumenism of the Spirit. A spiritual ecumenism is really the church really gathering, being together. The Spirit comes in, blesses it. But an ecumenism of the Spirit, distinct to spiritual ecumenism, is really the Spirit working, and it's the church trying to catch up. And so while you have in spiritual ecumenism, visible unity has to do with the heads of the church, right?
Sure.
In an ecumenism of the Spirit, the unity and the ecumenical working of the Spirit is found in bodegas.
We are kind of responding to the greater spiritual reality of unity rather than we are trying to implement programs of unity.
Well, it's more than that. It is really the Spirit's work. I mean, I'm a Pentecostal boy who got up one morning and said, "What's liturgy? What's Eucharist?" And where did that come from? because nobody was talking to me about liturgy or the Eucharist. But I surely woke up one morning and said, what is this? And what drove me there? I am convinced that it is the Spirit. And it is the Spirit's work in men and women around the world, who it is the Spirit driving them and leading them to levels of truth that they did not have. And these levels of truth, it is an ecumenism of the Spirit, because to have these levels of truth is to be able to come to the table with our brothers and sisters from the Roman Catholic tradition, the Eastern Orthodox tradition, the Anglican Methodist tradition, and have something to say and understand their traditions. I can't tell you how many times I've been in the presence of my Eastern Orthodox brothers, my Roman Catholic brothers and sisters, Episcopal, and things that they would have never thought that I knew, that I understood. In their tradition, we understand and we know, and some of the things we even practice. That's an ecumenism of the Spirit. That is the Spirit at work in the life of men and women around the world, bringing us closer, hungering, yearning for levels of truth, and bringing us closer.
I want to talk a little bit more about your focus in the book here on Pentecost itself. So when IVP sent us the announcement of all the books, it's like, okay, this is cool. And I'm familiar with a lot of this, but your book and Dr. Rutledge's book on Epiphany were the ones where I'm like, I'm really excited for those conversations, because like you said, yeah, like I'm aware of the biblical phenomenon of Pentecost, but like I don't like the church calendar, like the day of Pentecost. I know nothing about that, and I imagine that many of our listeners have just the vaguest notions of that. The same with Epiphany. Like, I mean, I went to a New Testament the Footsteps of Paul tour in Greece. They told us a little bit about Epiphany there, but like these two things, I'm very excited to just kind of expand the horizons on. You talk a lot about Pentecost on the liturgical calendar and biblically being so misunderstood. What are things that you've experienced as you are practicing and instructing? Like, what are a lot of the misconceptions that kind of come with Pentecost?
Well, one of the greatest misconceptions, of course, and first and foremost, it was a lot of fun to write, and I'm really excited for all of the other volumes. But the greatest misconception of the day of Pentecost is that the day of or Pentecost is just a day. And I know that the subtitle is a day of power for all people, but it is 50 days. And historically, and even in the Jewish calendar and practice, this was something that was counted down. Like there was a countdown, right? And so being immersed in the actual 50 days was as important as the day of Pentecost, because the preparation was as important as the actual day itself. And so to be able to walk through the 50 days, set your mindset, set your posture, set that kind of spirituality, that was vital. So that was just one of the things that was very important. For example, as I wrote in the book, but in the early church, according even to the Nicene Council, during the days of the 50 days before Pentecost, prayer was a posture that was taken upright. You were not allowed to kneel for 50 days in prayer because it was this upright posture of waiting, right? But then when the day of Pentecost came, then you had kneeling prayers, as I, flushed out some of the Orthodox prayers in the book. And then you had kneeling prayers, because once the Spirit came, then that's when you would be able to kneel. That's just a very practical example of some of the misconceptions. I think that also some of the misconceptions, particularly on, the charismatic Pentecostal side, I think that it's always, well, they spoke in tongues. No, they spoke in other tongues. And then that has social religious connotations connected to it, because it wasn't just social or spoke in other tongues for the sake of having spiritual tongues, but it was in order that they might be able to communicate. I think that the last thing that I could bring up out of many is that while we have always put a focus on the people who are speaking in other tongues, Acts places the focus on people who are hearing others speaking in their language.
Mhm.
And the miracle wasn't so much that others were speaking in other tongues as much as it was that those who were hearing them, right? That's the Hebrew, that's the Shema, right? Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. And they were hearing they were hearing in their own tongue, other people confess, right? The gospel, the good news, the sovereignty. And so when you have that kind of shifting, when you can shift from this place where you only understood that these people spoke in other tongues, but you can shift to saying, well, these people heard these languages, then you have a social religious phenomenon. Now we can start talking about how we can be multilingual in our conversation and how we can have a primary language of faith tradition, but then know other traditions as well. And that is the empowerment of the Spirit as well.
Well, and I think that, I mean, through all of human history and however long forward until the renewal of all things, that this is going to be valuable. But when things feel so divisive,
Yeah.
and segregated and hostile,
Mm-hmm.
like that message to me really becomes even that much more important and attractive, and like this is something worth studying and putting into practice, and at the very least not being ignorant on, which, I mean, I had the slightest understanding of Lent growing up. I knew nothing about the
Sure.
historical tradition and experience of Pentecost. So I mean, you talked about like the single sentiment or phrase, like Lent was about repentance,
Mm-hmm.
and Pentecost is about power.
Power.
What is important about power that, like, biblically and particularly now, like what are the important lessons in power that a Pentecost practice, if this is something that folks are able to get in the habit of and add to their
Mm-hmm.
spiritual language in their liturgical practices, what should we understand about power?
Well, when I wrote the book, I had this affinity. Esau said that if Lent is inescapably about repentance, I said, well, then if it's inescapably about repentance, if Lent is, then Pentecost is inescapably about power. And when I was growing up as a Pentecostal, power meant, some preacher yelling, power, power, and casting out
Right?
demons and miracles and signs and wonders, and that was power. And I think there's an element to that, right? That dunamis power, the authority, exousia. But I also think that it is also power for our own spiritual, ethical, moral, educational, intellectual life. I think it's power to change, right? That methaneo concept. I think it's power to change. First and foremost, to change our own relationship with ourselves, our relationship with God, to be more attentive, more tuned to that. But I think secondly, I think it's also the power to cause change around us and to be agents of change for a world in need. And so we have a whole bunch of powerless Christians who don't understand the empowerment of the Spirit and the purpose
who are grasping for so many worldly,
right,
physical, political,
right,
economical means of power to
right.
kind of like
Yeah,
mold things into their
yeah.
image.
Yeah, I pastor churches. I that's what I do. And I was just telling one of my churches the other day, like you can't always keep blaming your congressman. You can't always keep blaming your mayor or your whatever you council member if you yourself are not going out and embodying the empowerment of the Spirit to your community, to your children, to your family. And I'm reminded of that passage of scripture, I believe it's in Jeremiah, and pray and seek the peace of the city, for in its peace you shall have peace, right? Where you're not escaping this place, but in its peace you will have peace. And so if I don't become an agent empowered or have power to cause effect, then that has something to do with how I'm going to feel. And so that notion of power is important for me now as a social agent, as a religious social agent, to go out into the communities. So it's not only power to change me, but I think it's power to cause change, if that makes any sense.
No, absolutely. And in that vein, like the power to cause change, what are, from your vantage point,
Mm-hmm.
the similarities and maybe the unique flavors of the Pentecostal, Orthodox, Protestant, Catholic? Like, how are they complementary, and maybe how are they separate in those manifestations of power, kind of as the church universal?
You know, the Orthodox Church will always be up front, and I think they will always make sure to let everyone know that they're pneumatological, that the power of the Spirit exists. I really do think that that's true, even though there might not be manifestations of the Spirit, ecstatically, as there are in Pentecostalism. I think that Orthodoxy embodies a power of the Spirit in many facets, in their prayer life, in their liturgy. When you see their liturgy up close and you experience their epiclesis, that's an empowering moment. I think they also empower because of their witness socially. I'm thinking of, for example, our good friend, His Eminence Archbishop Elpidophorus, that embodies of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese. He's the Archbishop, and just embodies such an empowerment of the Spirit for social change and his perspective. Our Roman Catholic brothers and sisters do the same thing. In terms of their liturgy, their compassion, their social work. I worked many years with the Jesuit Refugee Service, and as a religious service specialist for the Department of Homeland Security, and just their
Oh,
work
wow.
around the world.
You've
Yeah.
lived a lot of lives.
Yeah, I have. I've done quite a few things. I think about Pentecostals and charismatics and evangelicals that are out there passing out tracts and praying for people and doing prayer walks. And so I think we all embody that type of power in one way, shape, or form. I think that the witness of the Spirit, the fruits of the Spirit, is important. And when we come together, it's just even more empowering.
One of the things that the more I dwell on it, the more it's just kind of like, kind of frustrating. Just like my spiritual, like the spiritual community in my head of like people who were like living within the will of God was just so small. In not to say like not in a universalist setting where like everybody's okay, and like if anybody's doing anything spiritual or religious, God is fully on board with it. Like, not saying that, but like making, like, not being the ones ourselves to kind of make the circle smaller.
Sure.
Because there are so many ways, like, and even biblically, like you had the apostles having differences with each other. So who are we to be like people in other cities, other countries, other contexts? Like, why would we spend the energy criticizing them?
Right.
Versus building them up, like, and even like following the Pauline example of whether in pretense or in truth, like even if they're just out there trying to like be some of the prosperity guys building up an empire for themselves, like if they're telling people true things about God and the Spirit is using it, like I'm happy for at least that. Like, where do you think that kind of comes from? The kind of that tribal infighting? Like, obviously you've spent a lot of time studying, and I think we here at The Substance, it is important to be thoughtful and in trying to be as God honoring as we can, and in his self-revelation in the Word and in nature and in church history. Like, we want to look at that and do our best to follow that path, but then to be gracious.
Yeah. I think it comes from a few different places, right? You're always going to have the theology police. I mean, it's just the truth. We're not going to get away from that. You're always going to have the theology police who they really do feel like, um, and I got to be careful. I've got to be careful because, um, I think they feel like we have to defend God, right?
That is absolutely it,
And
in my experience.
right, right. And I keep telling my brothers and my sisters, God, number one, doesn't need you to defend him. That's number one. Number two, you would not know where to begin if you could defend God. And if you could defend God, then we have no need for him. We have no need for that kind of God. That's number one. Number two, what you defend is the faith, right? That's what we're called. We're called to be guardians and defenders of the faith. And I also like to remind my brothers and my sisters, foreign and domestic. So from dangers foreign and domestic. And so you have this whole concept of apologetics. And, I got to say that there's sometimes, and I don't want to ruffle any feathers, but I've got to say that there's sometimes nationalistic, undertones to this.
Oh, yeah, quite a bit.
Yeah, because it's like, well, America is a Christian country and we've got to defend this. And, and these wonderful people, who think that.
Very gracious, Bishop.
Yeah. I'm trying, I'm praying for them. And I tell them all the time, like, guys, our main threat, I don't know if it's apologetics. I think it's polemic. And we're going back to the early church where the main threat to the early church, right? The third, fourth, and fifth century was not from without, was not outside. It was from within.
Yeah, basically breaking off into gangs and fighting each other based on their theology, which you check social media. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. So you've got exactly on social media, it is not uncommon.
I mean, we're not burning people in the town square currently, but it's not great.
Right. And so on social media, it is not uncommon for you to see a Christian drag another Christian. I mean, badly, because I don't know, you don't believe in whatever it is that you don't believe in. You're trying to take you have this affront and you're like flabbergasted that God is being, shown in this way, whether it's now we've got all these fights in terms of, God is a male. No, he's not. I mean, it's just insanity. And then they're using scripture and so I think that we see a lot of this, and unfortunately there's no grace. There's no common denominator. I go back to the phrase that has been credited to Augustine, that in essentials unity, in non-essentials diversity, but in all things charity. It's been attributed to him, but it's really does not belong to him. And so that's one of the motifs. That's one of the mottos that I live by. So I really get to, hey, do we have unity in essentials? If non-essentials, then we can have diversity. But even if in that, all things should be handled with, charity.
And I mean, this is something we've talked about a lot. The older I get, and as God is pleased to help me mature in whatever ways I am, my understanding, like the true essentials, like it's gotten smaller and smaller. The things that are truly essential, not important. Plenty of things are important, but you're not going to be, like you said, drawing the lines in the sands. And like, then you have like the church eating itself, like you saw early, and people coming to blows and taking each other's lives over points of doctrine. Yeah. And not that it's not important to have conversations, but sitting next to each other as brothers and sisters versus across the battlefield as enemies.
Yeah, I love the axiom quod ubique, quod semper, quod ab unibus credentem est. Latin for the faith that has been believed everywhere, always, and by all. Antiquity, consensuality, and universality. And as much as I love that axiom, I mean, I have to admit, when has everything been believed by all? I mean, it's just not the truth, right? You go into the history of the church and you're going to see different perspectives. I mean, even if you look at the Johannine community, right? The Johannine community was the first ones to celebrate Pascha in the way that they celebrated it for almost 200 years. The church didn't pick up on Easter. The church didn't pick up, celebrating Easter, Pascha on Nisan until 200 years after the Johannine community was doing it. And the Johannine community looked like they were crazy. I mean, there's always been some type of distinctions. My goal as an academic, as a pastor, as a minister that amalgamates these types of spirituality is to really find the common denominator in all these things as best as possible, and to say we can agree on these essentials in ways that bring us closer together.
So on that note in particular, I've become far more curious, and I feel like I've always been curious, but more actively curious and open. But what would be your encouragement to folks maybe raised with a strong foundation of cessationism to just this, I don't want to say genre, I feel like that's almost insulting, like this wing of Christianity, this tradition or this set of traditions of Christianity, somebody who has that strong foundation, who was just cessationism growing up, who's now like, how do I begin to think about things? What would be some resources or encouragements? Like if somebody's like, I would like to learn more, where would you kind of point them?
So first I would say, are they crazy? No, I wouldn't say that. No, I wouldn't say that. I have actual friends who are cessationists. And I tell them all the time, stay cessationist, man. I mean, just if that's your primary language of faith, then okay. But you can be bilingual, and that's where
I love. That was your first book, right?
That was in my first book.
I loved like the spiritual bilingual or whatever, however you said it. I loved that.
Yes, yeah, and there's some of that in Pentecost as well. And, I share with them, but be bilingual in your language of faith, but hold on to your primary language. It's like me, I'm Pentecostal. I can be multilingual, but I hold on to my primary language. And I think that, a good starting point would be good, reputable, charismatic, Pentecostal, evangelical sources that would be able to be responsible sources, because there's some sources that are just, with the ecstatic manifestations, they go so hard in the paint.
And a lot of the folks, I mean, I was raised that way.
Right.
For a long time, that was that wing was in my mind, most of what the ecstatic wing of the church kind of was, because that's what was presented to me as, this is not what we believe, and this is not how we practice and we do our faith, because look at this, this is clearly not of the Lord. And it's like, okay, I understand that, sure, but then it's like, well, that's not all that is, though.
No, and I mean, even historically, to be honest with you, when you read Polycarp and you start reading Basil, and even when you, in the 11th century, when you start reading Simeon, the new theologian, and some of the experiences that he's having with the Holy Spirit as light, and being intoxicated by light, and some of the transformative language that he utilizes, it mirrors a sousistry. And so what I would encourage is to really do a deep dive biblically and historically, utilizing responsible resources into the life of the Spirit in the church. And I'm always reminded, for example, my cessationist friends, they talk about the history of the gifts of the Spirit and ecstatic manifestations. And I remind them all the time, you guys do know that the early church was really concerned about the gifts of the Spirit. And I mean, this is real talk. And in a lot of ways, that kind of ecstatic manifestation was quenched because there was a fear of retribution from the social authorities. When you read Irenaeus in Against Heresies, he tells you the story of Cornelius's household. And he says something to the effect, of course, he's following along Peter's transition to Cornelius's house, and that when they spoke in tongues in Acts, when they spoke in tongues, that Peter knew they were baptized in the Holy Spirit. But Irenaeus changes speaking in tongues to prophecy. He does it on purpose. And if you read some of the historical context around that time, they were already saying that we drink blood and that we were vampires and that we were baby killers and that we were eating flesh. And now you're going to come and start speaking in tongues. You're going to freak people out. And so Irenaeus changes it from they spoke in tongues to they prophesied. And he does this on purpose, right? And so even historically, we see that there's this quenching because there's always a fear of retribution or misunderstanding by social authorities or the broader context, social context. So that exists today. There's some of that uncomfortability. But going back to reading responsible resources, doing a deep dive and being open to the life of the Spirit and what you find, if after you find or after you are exposed to the information and you say, I'm still cessationist, okay, let's look. No problem. But at least you have the information.
Well, yeah, that's also not an essential. And we can still do quite a lot of kingdom work and a lot of edifying and in charity ministries and a lot. We can do a lot together.
Yeah.
And be like, well, agree to disagree.
Yeah, one of the things that people really don't know is that there's this whole concept of initial evidence, right, of the Spirit that comes out of Pentecostalism, and it's this evidence. This is the evidence of the Spirit if you speak in other tongues. Well, even William Seymour, the Azusa Street Revival, said, no, the initial evidence is not speaking in tongues, right? It's love. So to be baptized in the Holy Spirit is not that you speak in other tongues, but to be baptized in the Holy Spirit, the evidence is love. So there exists some really, really concrete practices and theological beliefs.
I don't want to go down this topic too deeply, but you brought it up at the top, and then you just mentioned the misconceptions of the blood and the flesh. I don't know if you're familiar with the brother Flame, recording artist, used to be with the Cross Movement 116 guys. So we had him on when he dropped his last couple of EPs, talking about real presence. So we kind of got that discussion started.
Yeah.
My previous co-host, he was very strongly in the opinion of where he disagreed. I'm like, I disagree, but I also don't really understand. The arguments don't fully make sense to me. I also am not sure that if I fully understand them, because the people who I know and respect who hold to that, it's very important to them, and they are not foolish people. So I'm curious, briefly, what would you say is your biblical understanding of it? And also, not that I only want to be pragmatist, but when you take the Lord's Supper from that point of view, what is that? How is that experientially or functionally different from a real presence perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question. First and foremost, I'm of the opinion that you're not supposed to understand it. That's what faith is for.
My guy, the older I get, I feel like if we're gonna say this, and not to be glib, but something I say to people all the time is guys, the foundation of all of this, if we were saying God, Jesus, the Bible, is that at the beginning of all things, God spoke and existence came to be. So we can kind of chill on being well, that's a little silly and far-fetched.
Right.
Okay, guys.
My grandmother used to tell me, you're always trying to find the fifth leg on the cat. And that meant that, I was looking too hard. I was trying to understand something that I wasn't.
A lot of theology students, I'm a former seminary guy. I know a lot of the people in our, not loads, but I know plenty of people individually who I know who listen to the show. They have various higher education and like as theology students, like that's part of the environment, right? Like we want to know.
And I'm not against understanding. I think that there's PhD. I teach. I'm an administrator. I've written books. I write articles. And it conflicts with my faith. Because my faith, I have to believe. So I tell myself, Old Testament, well, Abraham, all this. No. Just okay. So tell me how. It still does not bring it home for me. At the end of the day, everyone has to go.
You can't do a math equation.
Right. Faith. So, and Jesus comes and says, "This is my body. This is my blood. And if you eat my body, drink my blood, I am in you and you are in me." And they were offended. And some people left. And, his disciples came and said, This is hard. Who can receive this? And he said, you think I'm talking about this flesh? And he says, no, the flesh profits for nothing. It is the spirit who gives life, right? And then he says something very interesting. He says, what if you were to see the Son of Man return from whence he came? Right? It is the flesh profits for nothing. It is the spirit that gives life. So Jesus wasn't talking about that fleshly body. What he was talking about was the body that was transfigured, the body that was transformed. The same body, by the way, that can walk through walls with the doors closed, right, and yet tell Thomas, touch me. So what body do you know can walk through walls?
Explain that to me, like biologically.
Right,
yeah.
Biologically, and yet be touched at the same time. I mean, it's unexplainable. And so that can only be explained by faith. So for me, when it comes to real presence is not transubstantiation for me. Okay, transubstantiation is this Western method. I'm not critiquing it. I just don't subscribe to it. It's a Western methodology. It has to do really with the celebration.
I'm still very much out on real presence, but the transubstantiation always seemed clearly just like it's either is or it isn't.
Right.
I'm not quite sure exactly what that matters, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. But like, it's not a magic trick.
Right. Yeah, and transubstantiation, for me, I think my fight with it is transubstantiation is really more kind of focused on the celebrant having the spirit, and at the words, the elements change, right? The ringing of the bells, right? And so when you have kind of the elevation, and then you're praying kind of the epiclesis, but it is the spirit that resides in the celebrant, right? Transubstantiation. Whereas in the East, it's a mystery, and I love that. In the East, we just don't know. We don't know, in the East, and those who subscribe to that, we don't know when it becomes the body and the blood. We just know it does by faith. It is a mystery. And so even in our churches, for example, whereas in a lot of the Western culture, the celebrant prays at the epiclesis over the wine and over the bread, in our tradition as Pentecostal Orthodox, that's a time where everybody is praying in the anaphora. Okay. Everyone is extending their hands, and everyone is believing that what's happening at that table is a transformation. How? We can't explain it to you, but we have the faith that it is happening, right? And it's a mystery to us. I can sit here theologically and explain to you, like I just did, some of the changes and some of the distinctions between transubstantiation and a mystery in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, and even consubstantiation, right? Where Luther thought that there is bread, wine at the same time, right? There is the body and the blood. But I rather have that be a moment where my humanity and my reason does not interfere with my spirituality and my faith. I'd
So
rather that be a moment for God.
from that point of view, though, how the folks who view it symbolically versus real presence, what do you think? I mean, do you think it's a traditional liturgical, like it kind of goes with it? Like what, in your experience, like
Yeah.
taking it from the point of view of real presence versus the symbol of
Yeah.
the gospel and the remembering. I actually just told a guest I recorded with recently, I don't know if it's going to be on the show, it might be a little bonus clip. I explained it briefly to my son. He's 4. And I always forget because he always asks me, "Hey, can I take it?" And I was like, "No, not quite yet, buddy." And I always forget to talk to him about it during the week. And then on Sunday morning, like as it's getting passed out, he's like, "Can I do it this week?" And then I kind of just briefly explained to him, like, "Hey, like this is kind of the idea of this. This is what we're doing." And then after we took it, because I told him like it was about remembrance, like Jesus established this as a way to remember him. And at the end, he looked at me very sweetly and so earnestly. He's like, "Dad, did you remember?"
Right.
And it was just the sweetest moment. But what would you say is like the difference between the symbolic versus the real presence?
Well, I mean, Jesus never said this is a symbol. This is a symbol of my body. This is a symbol of my blood. He never said it. He said this is, right? A very definitive in the Greek. This is my body. This is my blood, right? And so there was no real symbolic language. There was not even, there wasn't even any kind of suggestion of metaphor. That's backed in Acts when he breaks the bread and disappears. The reason he disappears with the 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus is because it's in the bread. He is now the bread. There's no longer any need for him to be physically here. He is with us in the breaking of the bread. And so symbolism for me has to always point to the thing that it is. So bread and wine are symbols that point to the real thing, and then by the power of the Spirit become the real thing. And I think that's the only language of symbolism that really, historically, we've seen the majority of. Number 2, when we look at this concept of remembrance, anamnesis, do this in remembrance of me, anamnesis, I'm reminded of the child that asks the father, how did the Lord bring us out of Egypt? And the father is to respond, the Lord brought us. This is how the Lord brought us, even today. This is how the Lord brought us out of Egypt. Why? Because that whole concept of remembering could not be done without bringing yourself into the story, making yourself as part of the story. And they still, of course, sit down and in Passover pass the herbs, the bitter herbs, on the table. So remembrance is anamnesis, and I think people want to be quick to bring remembrance into a cognitive memory type of experience, and it's not.
Sure.
It's more than that. It's literally sitting down at the table when Jesus was breaking the bread and passing the cup, being there. I think a lot of people have a hard time with that because they're like, "Oh, it's 2023. How can we go back?" Right? Well, that's the power of the Spirit by faith. And so being anamnetic in that way is really, again, a faith move by the power of the Spirit. So for me, it's become very, very hard for the Eucharist to be something that's just a symbol. It is part of our spirituality. It is a vital part of our spirituality because we believe that what we're eating is his body, what we're drinking is his blood. And if we do that, he's in us and we're in him, and then we have everlasting life.
That is something that it's not at the top of my list, but something that I'm curious and I will be pursuing and trying to kind of wrapping my head around a little bit more.
What book would be great? Brant Petree's Jesus and the Jewish Roots of the Eucharist.
I think Flame actually maybe mentioned that.
Yeah. Oh man, Brant Petree does a great job in bringing the Jewish roots of the Eucharist. But another good book is Alexander Schmemann's For the Life of the World. And oh my God, just two treasures that that I just go back to every year.
I do love those books that you can
Yeah.
kind of continually get back out of. So we have a one segment that I want to run with you here in a minute, but before we get to that, I'm very curious, kind of just looking at your bio and some of the work we did, just kind of on the real, like what was the Pope like?
You saw that. Okay. Really cool. Really cool. 2014, we got the opportunity, I with others, to have an audience with Pope Francis. And I ended up interpreting for Pope Francis at the meeting, which was unexpected. I didn't know that going into the Vatican. And we then got to eat lunch with Pope Francis and sit next to him, and we got to talk afterwards for some time. And I tell you what, sitting down next to Pope Francis was an experience, and I knew how much he was doing for the church when afterwards we went back to where we were staying, and I slept for like 6 or 7 hours because it felt like a Mack truck hit me. That's how tired I was. It was really this phenomenological experience. And when I reflected on that, some years later, it was just like a burden. You could feel the burden on him. You could feel the weight of his office and the responsibilities that he had. But overall, he was a very generous, earnest. He is the man that you see on TV. The guy that we all hear about, that's really him. He is gracious. He's earnest. He's a praying man. He just really is. And he has his own distinct charismata about him. He really does believe.
I mean, imagine you kind of have to, like, I feel like the office alone kind of has that looming over it.
Yeah. Well, he was the cardinal in Argentina, and in Argentina, by most of what I've read in terms of his history, I mean, he did have interaction with Pentecostals in Argentina, and they, the Roman Catholic Church and the church in Argentina, the Pentecostal church in Argentina, did have a lot of work that they did together. So he does have this type of charismatic influence. I'm not saying he speaks in tongues and does all that. I don't know, but you could tell that he has some real charismatic tendencies in terms of spirituality. So it was fun. Yeah.
I imagine regardless of one's initial thoughts on the Roman Catholic Church as a large entity and him as kind of the figurehead of that would have to be quite a powerful experience.
Yeah, it was a powerful experience. Once in a lifetime, I was privileged to do that with other brother bishops in the organization that we used to be with, and it was one that I'll never forget, and one that even my Roman Catholic brothers and sisters to this day, they remind me, oh, you went to see the Pope, and
a little jealous.
Just a little, it's about to be a decade removed, so it's old, but it's one of those things
that's so wild. Like the way time passes now. It's like,
that
was 10 years, that was 15 years ago.
You look at the pictures and, I have dark hair, and you see me today and it's like, gray all over. So it's been some time, but it was also a very good statement for the witness, for ecumenical witness of the church. And
that's what was exciting to me, because it's like, there are always valid things to bring up when ecumenical movements get traction, where it's like, what about this? What about that? Sure. But also, I think there is value in saying we would like to cast a vision of true ecumenical work.
Yeah. And, we were there because our good friend who has passed on to be with the Lord, Bishop Tony Palmer, who was part of the organization at that time, was a dear son to Pope Francis and a colleague. And so upon his passing, we were invited by Pope Francis to continue the conversation. So, Tony was an ecumenist. He just was. He loved to develop and promote ecumenical creativity, innovation, conferences. So that
Love
was a
that.
big loss. That was a big loss for us. But yeah, we haven't really done too much since then. But there's hope.
No, that is very interesting. I was like, I can't have an hour with him and not ask him about that. So now is the time for what we call substance shoutouts. So we've talked a lot of very deep things. You've given us a couple of really heavy resources. You can continue in that vein, or depending on what your personality and your interests are, give us something lighter. So substance shoutouts is, what have you been reading, listening to, watching, consuming? Films, books, televisions, podcasts, articles, resources, what have been either edifying you spiritually or just enjoyable engagements with things that are beautiful or interesting or fun? Like, what has been filling you up lately that you've been engaging with?
So lately I've been engaging with the pastor-theologian motif. Has really something, in majority of part, to do with my work at Asbury Theological, of course, as the associate provost. And the Pastor Theologian by Gerald Heiston and Todd Wilson has been one of the books that I have been reading just to kind of recover this ancient identity of the pastor theologian. So I've been really, really blessed by the work that they have done. There's several kind of books in that strand in terms of pastor theologian. The other one is by Kevin Van Hooser and Owen Strachan, the pastor as public theologian. That has also been a wonderful read, and then I think the last one that I've become really, I have affinity for is kind of the follow-up, Becoming a Pastor Theologian, New Possibilities for Church Leadership. And that's also by Todd Wilson and Gerald Heiston. So I'm on this kick lately to return this vision to the church, to the 21st century church, of the distinct tension that pastors and theologians can keep. And so there are people who are graced and skilled to be pastors and people who are graced and skilled to be theologians. I have been gifted by God to be graced and skilled by his mercy and grace to be in both. So I've been really recovering that whole vision and developing ways that we can implement that in the church and in the academy.
Well, I'm sure I am certain, I don't know how many of the listeners are going to run with these. I am certain my former co-host is going to add a number of these to his reading list. And I'm very curious about the Jesus and the Jewish roots of the Eucharist.
Yeah, you're going to enjoy that. I enjoy it, and I recommend it often. So it'll be very good. It'll be a good read.
Well, Bishop, I thank you very much for your time. Glad we were able to finally work this out. Excited about the new book. It's going to look great right next to Lent on the shelf, and I'm excited as these continue to come out for the rest of the year. Have you gotten to read any of the other ones yet?
I did read Esau's Lent. That was great. I haven't gotten a chance to read the others, but I will. It's on my list to do so.
Because we had a delay after delay, I was able to get the audiobook that you read yourself, and I was like, okay, like the audiobook version, I was able to lock into a lot more.
You know what's so funny, and I'll say this last thing. What's so funny is that I was having major allergy attacks while reading the book, the audiobook, and I was like, oh my God, I hope this sounds okay.
No, it sounded great. And I mean, I feel that way right now in this episode. So kind of it goes in circles here.
Right. Well, bless you.
Well, Bishop Alvarez, thank you so much for your time. And I really appreciated this discussion and look forward to seeing the ecumenical work that you get to do going forward.
Well, listen, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time and your patience.
I say this every time, but what a wonderful, encouraging conversation. I really love to see folks from whatever tradition it might be, who truly are about the fellowship of the saints, honoring God, lifting Him up, making the glorification of God and a good life and the good of those around us their main thing versus territorial or theological, even like kind of petty squabble. So really encouraged by that. Go check out his book, Pentecost. Links are going to be in the show notes for that. And because it took us so long to get to this conversation, you can go on Hoopla if your local library supports that and listen to him read his audiobook, which I did recently, and it was excellent. So highly recommend that. Go check it out. And I imagine, but we also should be having a giveaway. So be sure to check Instagram and Twitter is where that happens. Twitter looks like it's hanging on. So maybe we'll turn the corner on Twitter. Who knows? That'd be great. If, like me, you were really encouraged by that and you want to join us in support, the way you can do that is in the Anchor/Spotify for Podcasters link in the show notes. You can sign up at $5 or $10 a month. Or if monthly support is not your thing, you can do that on Cash App. But I know it's a hard time out there, but everybody who sends us a little bit money here and there on Cash App, and particularly the people who are subscribed to monthly support, we really appreciate that. Hopefully, as we get our bank of episodes filled up, Dave and I will actually be making an announcement soon and having kind of the first round of voting for the people who are at $5 or $10 a month for either a book or a movie in the coming several months. So be on the lookout for that. If you have any feedback, send your emails to thesubstancepod@gmail.com. You can send us an email or record a voice note. Email that into us. If you record a voice note and it's under 90 seconds or so, and we like it, we'll put you on the show. We always on the lookout for messages like that from the audience to share and encourage and kind of build a bigger sense of community here at The Substance. So send those in to us at thesubstancepod@gmail.com. And last but certainly not least, be sure to leave us a 5-star rating and a couple sentences of a review on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcast that they allow it. And it's a great way to help us build the show and to encourage more folks with conversations like this. So hope you guys have a wonderful week, and we will see you here next time on The Substance. Dave, you can cut this out if I tell you to, but I shouldn't because we don't have a lot of time.
Jesus and the Jews. Jesus, let me run that back, Dave.